A walk in the park. Rio sighed as he swept the floor of the anime store that he worked at. He had thought it would be a dream job, but his wage was too crummy to buy any of the many items which he so desired. He was so close, and yet so very far, from just about every manga, DVD or figurine he had ever wanted. He silently loathed the customers as he rang up their purchases. He was attractive, with stylish sunglasses that he never went without, and a spiky black hairdo that defied at least half of the laws of physics. He was tall and thin, but had well-defined muscles. That's what he told himself, at least, because, no matter how much he worked at it, he never felt quite right about himself. More importantly, he never had the money necessary to impress a woman, and so he found himself without a girlfriend. He yawned as he closed the store up for the night, then went home. For Rio, home meant a tiny little apartment on the third story of a building that had seen better days. The decades-old door to his abode squeaked when he kicked the door shut with his foot. He had moved away from his parents because he couldn't stand living with them anymore, but now that he was on his own he felt very socially detached. What he truly wanted, more so than the latest issues of his favorite anime, and everything else back at the store, was someone to spend some time with. His digital friendships were enough social fulfillment to keep him sane, but not enough to keep him happy. He needed more than that, and he knew it. It was when he checked his mail that night that he was saved from the tedium that had become his day-to-day life. 3 envelopes awaited him. The first envelope contained an overdue bill, so he tossed it into a corner. The second envelope was the same, and so it joined the first. At first he thought that the third and last would be the same, so he almost reflexively flicked it over to its nefarious brethren. Something made him take another look at it as it slid through his fingers mid-flick. It was not an overdue bill at all. It was a letter from Megacorp. He knew it could mean only one thing, so he tore into it with glee. It read, "Congratulations, sir. You are one of the fortunate few selected to appear on our hit TV show A Walk in the Park. Filming begins tomorrow at 8, so don't be late." Rio couldn't believe it. He was going to be on the most popular game show in the country. The latest game show craze to sweep the Japanese nation was very popular indeed. The show was simply called A Walk in the Park. The premise was straightforward. 10 young men competed in a race against the clock, each other and various obstacles, in order to find something hidden inside of a sprawling park that was located within one of Japan's more spacious cities. What must they find? Their masculinity, which at the beginning of the show is sapped away from them via Megacorp's patented TG ray gun, available at all major retailers for only 35,000 yen, limited charges only, batteries not included and some assembly required. The reward? The first 5 to finish get to go on a classy date with the other 5 who are stuck as women for the encounter. Expenses paid by Megacorp. The winners choose their dates in the same order in which they found their masculinity. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But so were the ratings. As if that wasn't over the top enough, somehow Megacorp managed to find all sorts of mystical creatures to challenge the contestants. Creatures that most people thought had been nothing but myths crawled out from the woodwork to find themselves on Megacorp's payroll. Some skeptics claimed that it was all a hoax, special effects, smoke and mirrors, that sort of thing, because everyone knew that reality TV wasn't really real. In this case, however, it was all quite real, frighteningly so for those crazy enough to sign up to compete. Megacorp ran not only this show, but a whole franchise. They had a show covering the resulting dates, a reality show for marriages that emerged from the dates, and so forth. The franchise was so large and diverse that it had made them Japan's most successful company. Anyways, an appearance on the show was Rio's only shot at getting a date, and if it went well the person might choose to remain in their form and become his girlfriend. Rio knew that he could win, since he spent hours training his body every day and his mind was sharp enough to solve whatever riddles they threw at him. Finally, here was his chance to get out there and make a human connection. If, of course, I win, he thought to himself. Which, of course, I will, he added. If there was one thing Rio had in spades, it was confidence. He went to sleep content that night and dreamed of his date to come. He would have a choice of 5 girls, because he was going to win. The TG ray gun always did a good job of making people attractive, but Rio wanted to pick out one that was just his type. When he awoke to see beams of sunlight pouring into his window in impressive numbers, he lunged to grab his alarm clock. 7:45. He had forgotten to set it, and would be late. Spending only the briefest of moments to face fault on the ground and idly twitch for a moment or two, he soon bolted for the park. He ran so fast that he left a trail of flames in his wake. Somehow, he arrived in time, barely. The 2 speeding tickets he had been issued for running over the speed limit slowed him down a little, but thankfully he lived close to the studio. He was quickly rushed off to make up, and 3 hairdressers cut their hands trying to reshape his spiky hair before they gave up. It was just that spiky. He didn't pay much attention to what exactly they did, because he didn't care and his mind was on the challenges ahead. In what seemed like no time at all, he found himself on stage, standing in a line with 9 other teens who were all about his age. They glanced at each other, sizing up the competition. Rio's confidence was further enhanced, not that it needed it, by his estimation of the other players. One of the guys was really pudgy and 2 others looked like total nerds. A few were pretty buff, but they didn't look like they had much brains. Only one of them looked like he might be real competition to Rio. He was fit and Rio could tell that he was a critical thinker. The man gave Rio a nod of acknowledgement, which Rio returned. Soon the cameras zoomed in on them one by one, and they each got their dose of the patented TG ray gun. Rio would be last, which he was pleased with, since it meant that he would get the chance to evaluate the babes with his male equipment still intact. He figured it might be harder to judge them properly after he was zapped. They all turned out to be sexy, in different ways. Some were absolute bombshells, while others were demure, petite and coy. There was a fiery redhead Rio really liked, along with a raven-haired beauty that he maybe liked even more. He would be hard-pressed to make his decision after he won. He was practically drooling over the smorgasbord of women. He thought it was unfortunate that they transformed them so quick though, that left him without much time to evaluate each one. Not only unfortunate but also unusual, on the TV show they normally spent more time on this segment. The strangely fast pace of the show meant that his time came before he knew it. Although the technology had been out for a while now, Rio had never experienced it for himself. Not that he wasn't curious, just that he had better things to spend his hard-earned yen on. Plus, while zapping someone else was considered a fun and generally harmless prank, the sort of people who went out and did it to themselves voluntarily were considered unusual at best. So, it was with no small amount of trepidation that Rio stared down the barrel of the ray gun as the host pulled the trigger. The beam was pink, of course, and when it hit Rio his world exploded in a flash of white. He had expected some tingling or something, but the transformation was so rapid and dramatic that it simply gave his brain too much to process in too little time. The result was sensory overload and a feeling of shock tinged with panic. For a moment he even thought that he might have died, but his senses were not entirely gone. Distantly, he heard the host explaining that this was a new model of the TG ray gun, with a new ultra-super sexy setting. The host went on to say that this setting had been used on Rio, and soon everyone would get to see the results. Apparently for only 20,000 yen more this gun was quite a steal, and everyone should add it to their TG ray gun collection. As Rio's vision cleared, he heard catcalls from the audience. The host asked if he would like to see himself in a mirror, and Rio said yes. The sound of his new voice, a throaty, feminine, sensual purr, shocked him and made him fear what was ahead. Sure enough, the image in the mirror was way beyond being merely attractive. His, or rather her, new body, and the clothes that went with it, were just too much to take in all at once, much like the transformation had been. Rio took a deep breath to calm herself, and tried to slowly look at this strange new person in the mirror. She decided to start at the bottom, and work her way up. Rio's new legs were long, with creamy, smooth, exposed skin. Her running shoes had been transmogrified into pearly white slippers, with a 2-inch heel and pink bow ties on the front. The feet inside were now dainty and small, just like her new hands. The too short, frilly, white, pleated skirt she wore did little to hide the spectacular posterior she now possessed, which shook briefly when she spun around to get a look at it in the mirror. The host shouted something in English which sounded like junk in the trunk. Junk in the trunk! Rio had no idea what that expression meant, but the audience laughed uproariously. She was quite sure from the tight feeling against her crotch that she was now wearing a thong, although she definitely was not lifting up the skirt to verify that on national television. Somehow she instinctively knew the thing was pink. Call it woman's intuition. The skirt ended just where her hips flared out to their broadest, and from there it was exposed skin all the way up her slim, toned waist. She felt like a piece of flesh for sale at market, which as far as the producers were concerned was exactly what she was. Gazing down and seeing cleavage instead of toes and feet was certainly a new experience. Her breasts were huge to her eyes, and she made the mistake of cupping them in disbelief, which made the host go crazy with his commentary. She quickly took her hands off when she realized what she had done, but couldn't shake the feeling that the sheer size of them should be making her fall flat on her face. Or actually she would land on her breasts, now, which certainly weren't flat at all. From what her quick feel had shown her of their sensitivity, that would not be a good idea. Her breasts were pulled together tightly by a scant white top. The top had a large striped collar, but it plunged downwards to reveal more than she was comfortable with. Its sleeves went just past her feminine shoulders before ending in lacy frills. Small bits of pink trim and embroidery were just about everywhere, so much so that it practically looked like a risque undergarment. An ornate pearl necklace crept down her neck. The crowning gem of the necklace was a cloudy pink gem which nestled itself gentle in her cleavage. At first she thought that it helped her save some semblance of modesty by covering her exposed chest, but then she realized that it only drew even more attention to her already prominent bust. Her arms were smooth and devoid of any muscle. Silky, opalescent gloves went just beyond her elbows, where they hardened and flared out into a pointed V shape. A long, streaming, pink ribbon fluttered down from the end of each glove, attached to the inside of the V ending past her elbows. The gloves were without fingertips, coming only to her palms, exposing her fragile hands and long nails, which were painted pink, of course. Her hair was long, blonde, and as silky as her outfit. A single, dyed pink strand was curled and wound its way down the side of her face, while the rest clung tightly to her frame as it stretched down to the small of her back. Several pink ribbons ran with her hair, clasped to it by small ivory brooches inset with a pale rose gem. What struck Rio the most about her new appearance wasn't the outfit, however. Or the legs, or the midriff, or the chest, or the tush, or the hair, or the arms, or the hands. No, it was the face that was truly remarkable. If God ever deigned to send angels to earth, they would take one look at Rio and be overcome with envy. Everything was perfect, from the set of her cute little nose to the dimples in her cheeks, from the regal cheekbones to the shape of her luscious lips and their vibrant color, from the fairness of her skin to the slim arching of her eyebrows or to the natural darkness of her long lashes. She was more beautiful than any girl had a right to ever be, let alone any guy. Above and beyond even all of that, though, were her impossibly warm and impossibly pink eyes. The real question wasn't how on earth they were pink, but how on earth did they draw you in and captivate you the way they did. Sensuality was splashed all over her face, but most of all her beauty came from her eyes. Deep warm pools of light that you could lose yourself in forever and be happier for it. At least Rio now knew why so little time had been spent on the others. She, not the other transformed women, was the main attraction. How flattering, she thought, dryly. She was comfortable with the attention she was getting from the male viewers in the audience, whose catcalls were only now being hushed down by the host. Once he calmed them down, he announced that there would be a small commercial break before they began the walk in the park. The contestants used this time to take stock of each other or themselves. Some gingerly felt their new forms, unbelieving of the changes. One by one, each contestant's gaze came to Rio, until eventually they were all focusing their attention on her. She had been a man only moments ago, so she could not help but blush at the attention of all these beautiful women, although she felt her body react to it in a whole new way. She tried to make conversation, but they were too busy staring. Some stared at her bust, others stared at her legs, most stared into her eyes, but they all stared. Soon, as one, the rest of the contestants reached an agreement. They all decided to do whatever they could to make sure Rio lost. They had decided who they wanted to have their date with, even though only one of them could win her. They would make sure she finished in the bottom 5. Rio protested that such an alliance against her was unethical and against the rules and spirit of the game, but evidently she had watched far too little reality television. Her head spun as she realized that the game had just gone from a free-for-all to 9 against 1. She still had her wits and her strength to rely on though, and that kept her confident. That's when it hit her: she was now a lithe, fragile, defenseless woman. She had lost the bulk that she had been counting on helping her to win. How stupid of her to think that would make any difference in a new form. Rio gulped in fear and went doe-eyed at the revelation, and the audience laughed at her plight. Perhaps she should have thought through her decision to apply to the show more. What if she ended up on the wrong side of the gender fence for the date, the prize for some man to take? She shuddered at the thought. Soon they were back on air, and the host gave them a nefarious twist. Rather than being driven to the park to start their search, they would begin here in the studio, now. He then promptly fired a gun in the air to begin the race. The other contestants were off like a rocket, and they shoved Rio to the ground. Hard. Her landing was softer than expected thanks to her generous posterior, but it still stung. She darted up again, inadvertently giving the camera a perfect panty, or, more accurately, thong, shot, to the delight of the host. She rushed to the door the others had left through, only to find they had locked it behind them. Things didn't look good, she thought as she made her way toward the back fire exit. The race had barely started and already she was behind. The trip to the park was hell. Running as fast as her new body allowed her, the sexy, long legs being good for something, at least reminded her of her new body every step of the way. Or, more accurately, every bounce of the way. Her skirt rose up to flash her underwear to hapless bystanders as the flesh beneath jiggled rhythmically. Every time she felt her perky melons bounce up within her top, she uttered a silent prayer that they would stay contained. She left a trail of men with serious nosebleeds lying inert on the sidewalk in her wake. Some of those poor men would take days to recover. By the time she arrived at the park, the exertion had really taken a toll on her. Her sweat made her now moist top cling tightly to her chest, and a critical observer could clearly see what her outfit was lacking underneath the top. Here's a hint: it wasn't nipples. She leaned forward, putting her hands on her knees and panting to regain her breath. Or, at least that's what she did until she looked up and saw the angle the cameraman was getting down her top. In a knee-jerk reaction to hide her cleavage, she stood up a bit too fast. Her twin cups didn't lose their momentum after she jerked herself upright, so Rio had to quickly grab them to keep them in her top. Needless to say, her antics would be earning her a prominent part on the episode. Renewing her efforts to find her lost masculinity, she jogged into the park. She realized that she needed to pace herself, and frankly her newly acquired assets were beginning to hurt a little from all that movement earlier. Rio swore directly at her breasts, cursing them for slowing her down. Seeing a woman talking to her breasts certainly gave the TV audience back in the studio a laugh. She scoped out the park while resting and drew up an efficient route to cover most of it without backtracking in her mind. The park was certainly large, but not huge. A well-thought-out search would cover most of the ground soon enough. Once she felt better, she ventured out to begin looking for whatever awaited her. Rio occasionally saw other contestants searching as she performed her own search, but she made sure to stay clear of them lest they jump her and try to knock her out of the competition. Although the other contestants would love to ensure that Rio remained encased within her delectable curves for a date, they were not willing to go too far out of their way to get her. After all, they had to make sure that they were in the top 5 to have a shot at winning Rio for a date. It was a delicate balance of being cautious and quick while also searching carefully and deliberately. She knew that if she went too fast and missed things, then she'd just wind up crisscrossing the park over and over again in vain. She wasn't sure if her approach was just the right mix of those approaches, but it was certainly better than the way some of the idiots she was competing against were just running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Her efforts were rewarded sooner than expected. It would appear that luck was on her side. Her reward came in the form of a cryptic instruction found on a note hidden under a rock which looked rather out of place. The riddle read, "Come to the pond and cast a stone into the waters. The first thing you desire shall be given unto you, but be careful, for once the choice is made it cannot be undone." She had passed a pond earlier which she could go back to no problem, but the murky thread at the end was rather vague and gave her an uneasy feeling. However, Rio knew this was a chance to finally use her brain. She certainly wanted the reward, but was the risk worth it? As she pondered, she caught a glimpse of one of her Kuvya competitors searching nearby, and they suddenly gave her a devious idea. "Yes, that's what I'll do," she thought to herself. She took the note and put it at the middle of 2 crossing paths, with a pebble on top to keep it from blowing away, in plain sight. Hopefully someone else would find it in no time at all, and then they would take the risk for Rio while she would be hiding in position to snatch the reward from them. A few minutes passed, and Rio thought about maybe moving the note to a more central location, or maybe just abandoning the whole idea. She decided to give it another couple minutes, but she couldn't just wait forever or the other contestants would win before her. Rio's patience was soon rewarded only a minute later when one of the other contestants found the note. Rio watched her read it over a couple times and saw her pondering in deliberation. Rio held her breath, wondering if her gambit would pay off. Luckily for Rio, the woman was one of the denser contestants, and she took the bait. Rio followed the other woman quietly at a distance as she made her way to a pond in the north end of the park. Rio hid herself in a bush which yielded both good cover and a good view, and which was also close enough to intervene quickly if needed. She watched intently as the woman picked up a stone and cast it into the calm surface of the pond. At first, Rio couldn't quite make out what happened. All she saw were the ripples spreading out from where the stone sank into the depths. Then she saw it. Lying there on the ground in front of the woman was a hamburger? How odd, Rio thought. It was wrapped up in the markings of a local fast food chain restaurant. The woman shook her head, and the meal vanished in a gaseous vapor. Once the vapor dissipated, there was a small pile which sparkled like gold where the hamburger had been. Gold indeed it was, along with diamonds and other rare jewels. Rio's eyes lit up at the sight. Gemstones, amulets, necklaces, trinkets, the stuff must have been worth a fortune. Before Rio could attempt to figure out how much it must have been worth, the woman shook her head again and the gems and jewels vanished, ethereal. They were swallowed by smoke just as the hamburger before them had been. Rio whispered as understanding came to her. The note had specified the first thing you desire would be yours, so this was a game of temptation. Rio knew that she would have to resist in order to get to the true prize. It was a good thing she hadn't tried to face the challenge on her own, because she definitely would have pocketed as much of that wealth as possible. Enough to cover her manga addiction for at least a year. Rio was worried now though, because since the woman had refused all that wealth, she must have figured the challenge out as well. I underestimated her, Rio cursed to herself. If her bait didn't spring the trap and snatch the reward, then Rio's cleverness would cost her the only clue she had found so far. In the meantime, while she searched for that clue and wasted time on this ploy, who's to say how much closer the others had become to winning? Rio got ready to spring from her hiding place, to attack the woman to prevent her from achieving victory. She would get whatever treasure this pond held for her one way or another. What Rio saw next, however, made her stop dead in her tracks. A tall man stepped forth from the obscuring vapor, his wide rippling chest laid bare with no shirt to cover it. A bronze sheen covered his skin, and Rio could smell a faint musk even at the distance she was. His features were strong and chiseled, and his hair was a shoulder-length wavy blonde. Rio's heart began beat faster as her womanly eyes feasted on the sight before her. Even though as a new woman Rio was perhaps prone to being overcome by her body's unfamiliar urges, this man was no ordinary attraction. He exuded a steady stream of pheromones that would make the most modest nun in the world go wild. Even the whiff of it Rio was getting at her distance was making her will dissolve and drawing her thoughts towards carnal pleasures she had never dreamed of experiencing. Despite knowing that she was a man, and that these thoughts were most certainly not sort of things that men did, she could not help but feel their powerful allure. While her new body would have responded physically to any handsome normal man, her mind would have found the thoughts too repugnant to become truly turned on. This, however, was no normal man, but rather a creature that thrived on seduction, who knocked down Rio's flimsy mental reservations like they weren't even there. Rio could feel what she knew must be arousal spreading like fire through her veins, and she clenched her thighs tightly together. The man's pants were tight, and Rio could see what they contained. She could see where what it contained began, she could see where what it contained ended, and she could see just how much space there was between where it began and where it ended. She could not take her eyes off of it, and could not deny how much she wanted it, no matter how hard she tried. Luckily for Rio, however, she was hidden away in the bush. The woman by the lake was not so lucky, however. She stood paralyzed as the man approached her. It was as if though the faster the two women's hearts beat, the more time slowed down for them. The man slowly took the woman before him into his arms and gave her gentle, loving caresses. His ministrations were slow and patient, for he was waiting for an invitation. Rio felt a surge of jealousy as she wished it was her there in his arms. Ever so slowly, the woman tilted her head back slightly, looking up into the eyes of the man above her. Not slowly because her resistance made it slow, but rather because she was too intent on enjoying the hedonistic pleasure of the moment to have it end any sooner than necessary. She closed her eyes, and opened her lips, waiting to be taken. The man reached down and kissed her passionately. It was so intense that Rio could almost feel his lips on her own from her distance. The woman's body stiffened within the man's embrace, although she didn't notice it through the bliss. Her limbs numbed, and when he released her from his arms, she fell to the ground with a thud, paralyzed completely. She was enraptured by dreams of ecstasy, being taken by her devout forbidden lover on faraway beaches and fantastic castles. She had been given what she desired. A bit of the man's true nature shone through as he finished his meal. His eyes flashed a demonic red and small horns grew from his forehead. He was in truth a type of demon known as an incubus. Well, thought Rio, that's one less contestant in the running. As far as the rules were concerned, it was entirely possible for everyone to be eliminated if they were all incapacitated, although somewhat unusual. If there were 6 or 7 women in the end, that just meant more choice for the men, and Megacorp made the unchosen women star in episodes of makeover shows, using their already beautiful bodies to sell its lines of makeup, clothes, and accessories. The corporation really had this very well thought out, and they worked it from enough angles to make a perfect circle jealous. Reasserting her mind's control over her body wasn't easy, but Rio managed to do it after a few moments. Meanwhile, the handsome suitor stood there, waiting calmly for a new lover to take into his arms. Although Rio knew the danger, she could not totally eliminate the dull ache she felt in her loins. While her mind was back in control, there was still no denying what her new body wanted. However, she knew she would not win this show by hiding in bushes, so she went out to face her waiting Adonis. As he turned his gaze to her, she felt her pulse quicken once more. She had thought that her distant experience was exposure enough to immunize her against the full blast, like a flu vaccine. She soon found that she was wrong. In an instant she stopped thinking things, and instead only sensed them. She could feel the cold air from the lake against her moist top, as chilly tendrils reached through the fabric to the flesh beneath. She could taste him on her lips as the scent of him filled her mind. She could touch his perfect shoulders. Her legs quivered, but her resolve did not. Even though every step she took brought her deeper within his thrall, she held fast. "He's a monster, he's a monster." She repeated slowly in her mind, the mantra keeping her focused. Somehow, she maintained a shred of control even as she stood before him and he wrapped an arm around her. With her tenuous control, Rio thought of the ugliest, nastiest, most perverse and wrong things she possibly could. She filled her mind with disgusting things that need not be related in words to convey their immorality and grotesqueness. She clung hard to these thoughts, and when the man slowly ran a finger up her neck to raise her mouth towards his, she pushed him to the ground. He looked startled and betrayed, but when he fell he vanished into a creeping mist that slid over the waters of the pond and descended into the depths. In the gaseous cloud, only a tiny little sphere about the size of a marble remained. It was full of concentrated male energy. It was the prize which the contestants needed to find to make themselves the victors of this bizarre contest, but Rio could tell just by looking at it, it wasn't hers. The energy she had found belonged to one of the other contestants. It had an aura about it, and it was definitely not attuned to her. It was mojo, but since it was not hers, that made it a no-go. That was the trouble with the park. Even if you face a challenge and succeed, there is no guarantee that the reward received would be the one needed. Still, though, it belonged to one of the other contestants, hopefully not the one lying paralyzed on the ground, and it could perhaps be traded with its true owner. Even though it was not what Rio needed, she was intelligent enough to know that it could still be used as a bargaining chip to get her what she did need. Rio went to put it in her pocket, only to discover that her skirt was quite useless in that regard. For a split second she wished that she was carrying a purse, but then she smacked herself on the forehead for even thinking such a thing. Searching everywhere for a pocket, and not wanting to hold onto the thing, Rio sighed and gave up. She put it down her top, between her two generous endowments for safekeeping. She didn't like it, but she had no better solution. The cameraman caught the moment on tape, and that footage made its way into the final cut of the show with ease. Rio was glad her wits had proven their worth, as her body was showing itself to be nothing but a liability so far. Sadly, though, her clue was now all used up and she no longer had any leads. Still, she had gained a valuable bargaining chip, and one contestant had been knocked out. Things were going well. She resumed her efforts to win back her masculinity and get a date with one of the babes. The one lying there on the ground was quite the looker, and judging by the way she writhed in her dreams, she wouldn't be too bad after the date either. Even as she put more physical space between herself and the pond, the events she had experienced there left her rather unsettled. Being transformed into a woman was one thing, but what she had experienced had challenged her very identity. She tried to forget what she experienced, but could not, and the feelings she had made it more than a little difficult for her to think of herself as a man. Was she a woman, then, she wondered? Hell no, she thought, I'm not some woman who cooks and cleans and stuff. Her idea of a woman's role was not exactly progressive, and she rejected it as something she could never apply to herself. And I'm certainly never going to get into those awful romance manga. I'm a man, and I'll prove it by winning this dumb competition. Meanwhile, back at the studio in a closed meeting of the producers. Producer 1, I see that contestant Rio has passed her first challenge. Producer 2, good, we want to make sure she loses so we get the added date exposure, but we don't want to knock her out of the running right away. Producer 1, yes, I'm well aware. Producer 3, with conditions in the park as tightly controlled as they are in our ability to monitor the situation. Producer 1, there's no way she can win. Producers 1, 2 and 3 all grin wickedly. And now back to Rio. Rio searched in vain for a while before finally she found her next challenge. Or rather, until it found her. A giant sphinx pounced from its hiding place and pinned Rio to the ground. It was no ordinary sphinx though. It had the body of a beautiful woman, covered in tiger's fur all over. She had cat ears atop her head, and massive wings of an eagle spreading out behind her arms. A lizard's tail coiled around her leg, and her tongue was forked. Her eyes were constantly shifting, from human to avian to reptilian to feline, in a very disturbing manner. Every inch of her looked like a predator, and Rio felt like her prey as deadly claws made sure she did not move. Even though it had caught her completely by surprise, Rio was quick enough to think on her feet. Give me a riddle, she demanded, before the beast could devour her. Rio recognized the creature for what it was, and had heard that sphinxes were sometimes spared the lives of those who could answer their riddle. She had no idea if the sphinx would comply, but from what she knew of them in mythology it seemed like her best chance for getting out from under its paw. The creature smirked, pleased by her request. A riddle, mortal? Very well, I shall think of one just for you. It paused for a moment as it thought, this will do nicely. Nice and simple for you, it said while it ran its tongue across its lips. You a man or a woman? Sphinx riddled. Rio laughed at the simplicity of the question and almost immediately said she was a man without even thinking. She caught herself at the last moment. Then she gulped as she realized just how deadly this simple question truly was. Would she claim to be a woman, only to have the Sphinx laugh and fly off with hers masculinity, dooming her to fail? Or would he claim to be a man, only to have the thing prove the falsity of that statement, and then devour her? Sweat built on Rio's brow, and the Sphinx pressed closer, demanding an answer. Rio was damned if she did, damned if she didn't, and with no chance of overpowering the Sphinx she could see no way out of this one. Could she say that she was both? Or neither? No, those were both false as well. She was clearly a woman, but not. Finally, the answer came to her, and she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it earlier. And what I am. She shouted at the Sphinx, and pushed the creature aside. It gave way, and let out a laugh that was part womanly giggle, part hiss, part purr and part cackle. You have answered wisely, mortal, it said, and have realized something about yourself that most people never learn. Then it flew away, but not before leaving another shining orb of masculinity behind. Rio cursed, for once again, the orb was not her own. She took a moment to think about the Sphinx's parting comment, and supposed that her riddle's answer had been truer than she realized. Despite being a woman, she was still the same person now as she had been before. Perhaps being a woman and being herself were not as diametrically opposed as she had thought. In any event, now that she had retrieved 2 orbs, she was guaranteed that one belonged to someone other than the woman who had been eliminated. Now Rio had some serious bargaining power. She decided that it would be a good idea to try and seek out the other players. Rio knew that caution would be required, lest she be double-crossed. It had to be done though, for if someone else had found her masculinity, there was no way to win without making a trade. If she waited too long and kept looking, the 2 bargaining chips she held would become worthless. Wait too long and 5 of the contestants would win before her, and she would lose along with the 2 people whose masculinity she had found. Time to try some diplomacy, she thought. The park was quite large despite being nestled in such a metropolitan city, so it took Rio a while before she bumped into another one of the contestants. She hoped that it was taking so long because many of the contestants had been eliminated, like the one who had fallen to the trap at the pond. Having barely escaped the earlier riddle, Rio knew how easy it was to be knocked out of the competition. Still, thinking of the way that the eliminated woman had cried out in pleasure as she dreamed made Rio almost wish she had been eliminated too, but she quickly quenched the thought. Of course, despite the size of the playing field, another encounter was always an inevitability. The first woman Rio met in his search to cut a deal had nothing to bargain with, although it turned out one of the 2 orbs Rio had found belonged to her. There was a rather awkward moment when that fact was established. Silence hung in the air. Silence did not have to hang for long, however, as the woman he met was not about to let this chance pass her by. She jumped Rio and tried to steal the orb she needed, but Rio saw it coming and ran for it, not wanting to get hurt in a fight. Instead, she wisely relied once again on her long legs, but the woman was hot on her heels, shorter but desperate, and Rio was getting more and more winded. Finally, when she was not able to run another step, she was forced to stop. Rio looked around, panting, and found herself standing in a stone pavilion. Breathing seemed so much harder in her cursed new body, her lungs struggled to lift the weight of her bosom with every breath. She looked about her surroundings some more as she took the much-needed reprieve, searching for anything that would be advantageous in the fight she would face when the other woman caught up in a moment. Grass pushed up everywhere through the cracks in the old stone tiling the place, and a large statue of an angel stood at the center with an ancient-looking plaque beneath it. Rio's spirits fell upon seeing nothing here which would aid her. Defeated and ready to hand over the prize peacefully rather than risk losing in a struggle, Rio idly moved over to the statue to read the ornate gilded plaque as she waited to surrender. It read, "This is a place of peace and honest trade. Strike another in force or even try, falsify the truth or make a lie, and your chances of winning will forever fade." Rio couldn't believe her luck. Did this mean what she thought it did? Rubbing her hands together as she thought up a devious plan, she could barely contain herself from jumping with joy. She did her best to look neutral though, because she didn't want the other woman to suspect something was up. She moved to stand in front of the statue, obscuring the plaque, and awaited her assailant. This was yet another lucky break which would go her way, and if her luck held, Rio would soon eliminate another competitor. The woman arrived soon enough. "Hand it over," she demanded smugly. No, Rio refused flatly. The woman looked surprised, and very annoyed. "Hand it over now," she emphasized, "it's no good to you anyways. Do you really want the trouble?" Rio did not dignify her threat with a response, and chose to remain silent. That only infuriated the other woman more. "Now," she demanded. Negotiations were breaking down rapidly, but Rio was quite pleased with that. Then, the woman drew closer, not content to let the matter lie. She raised a hand to strike, and Rio did not flinch. As the woman's hand whooshed forward to slap Rio, roots shot up from the earth where she stood and entangled her hand. In less than an instant her attack had been halted, and Rio giggled without noticing it. The roots caught her hand in midair, and Rio knew her plan had worked. More vines leapt up to encircle her, binding her feet, her arms, immobilizing her. She struggled, but the leafy embrace just coiled tighter, making any resistance futile. "What have you done?" she shrieked. "Let me out of here." "I don't think you're in any position to be making demands, Missy," Rio taunted her. That only served to aggravate her even more, and the woman fought wildly, until thorns popped out of the roots. They dug into her skin, and they were laced with a potent toxin. The more she thrashed, the deeper and further they cut into her skin, letting more and more of the venom seep in. Soon she could move no more, for her muscles had been locked in place by the poison. She could only move her eyes in horror, trapped motionless and rooted in place. Another victory for Rio. Rio stepped aside, smirked, pointed to the plaque she had been obscuring. Ignorance of the law was no excuse. Rio laughed as she pointed to the words behind her. After she read the sign, the woman shot Rio a look of pure malice, and Rio laughed. Rio walked up to her and kissed her. "I like feisty women. I just might pick you when I'm done winning this game," she said. Rio's gloating was cut short by someone clapping from behind her. Rio quickly spun around to face the newcomer, her hair and ribbons whirling dramatically behind her. The newcomer was a third woman, one of the other contestants. My, aren't you the clever one?" the newcomer said. "Too bad you weren't clever enough to find this." She held out a shiny orb. And this one, Rio knew, was hers. This woman had somehow found Rio's lost masculinity. With her eyes on the prize, Rio licked her lips in anticipation. "This is it," she thought. "I'm going to win." Rio began to think of a way to get this newcomer out of the safety of the bargaining grounds so that she could jump her and take the orb by force, when the woman spoke to her. "Now, before you get any ideas," she told him, "one of those two orbs you have, down your top, just happens to be mine." "What good luck!" Rio thought triumphantly. An even exchange, here where there could be no duplicity, and both of them winners. Rio took another good look at the woman. She was the redhead he had been rather fond of. Still, though, there were other options. They agreed to put their orbs on the ground where they stood, and walked over to switch spots and make the exchange. It was so straightforward Rio almost thought it too good to be true. When they were at the halfway point, passing each other, the other woman gave Rio a fiendish smile. Oh no, she couldn't possibly have something up her sleeve, could she? Rio thought. She couldn't work out how this could go wrong, but the thought made Rio walk a little bit faster to get to her masculinity. When she got there and held it within her hands, she could feel that it truly was hers, but somehow not. It felt right, but it was stuck there, in the orb. Trapped or something. She spun in anger at her deceiver, only to see her change in front of her eyes. In a flash of light her form reverted as she reclaimed her lost male essence. It was one of the nerdy types, and he stood there laughing at her. "You stupid idiot," the nerd mocked. "But, you lied. That is against the rules of this place," Rio protested. "I did no such thing. I never claimed that to be anything. You are the one who reached the false conclusion about it, all on your own," he snickered. But how?" Rio said dejectedly. The nerd shrugged, but was more than happy to gloat about his victory. I thought it belonged to me as well when I first saw it. But it didn't. It's male energy all right, and it was calling out for an owner, but it's broken or something. I guess it's some sort of decoy, a twist trick used by the show hosts. After I acquired it and discovered these exchange grounds, I just waited for a dummy like you show up with my orbs so I could dupe them, and you were kind enough to be the dummy I needed. Rio was furious at the deception, but the nerd had not lied, at least not as far as the exchange grounds were concerned. He had never said the orb was anything other than what it was. It was Rio who had made that mistake. Rio wanted to strike out at him, to take revenge. The wimpy guy didn't look like he would be able to defend himself. Even in his rage though, Rio knew that the exchange grounds would allow no violence, so she was unable to get her justice. It was doubly frustrating for Rio to have been tricked, but also not even be able to do anything about it. The man could see her fury, and he just laughed at her. Rio turned her back on him and stormed off. Big mistake. She shouldn't have lowered her defenses, because the man ran and tackled her from behind as soon as she was beyond the protection of the bargaining grounds. "I'm not done with you yet," he yelled just as he was about to knock into her. Rio was shocked, taken by surprise as she fell to the ground, landing directly on her chest. She winced in pain, and the man above her took the opportunity to pin her arms to the ground. Rio had thought him to be a weakling, but it turned out her new body was even weaker. With her arms trapped and his weight above her, there was little she could do. A panic she had never known before gripped her as she felt truly vulnerable for the first time in her life. The man jeered at Rio from above. "You forget, pretty little thing, that although I have won, I still want to see you lose." The rules allowed any victors to help or hinder the remaining contestants as they would. "Don't worry though, I won't do anything ungentlemanly. I'll be saving that for after our date," he laughed. Rio snorted in disgust. "No way would I date a pig like you," she said as she struggled to throw him. "I'd only settle for a real man." She paled as she realized what she just said. "Oh my, the lady has standards," the nerd said, his tone upset. "Sadly for you, what you don't have is a choice. I won, and you'll be dating me." He pushed down harder, using more force than was necessary to restrain Rio. Rio could still barely believe what she had said. It was true, of course, that she'd never go for a loser like this guy in a million years, but as for the rest, what was coming over her? She cursed her body and all its weaknesses, and her struggles lost their willpower. They were little more than a show of protest, for she had given up. Suddenly, she felt something smash into the man on top of her with the impact of a freight train. The furious assault knocked her assailant off of her, and she turned her head to gaze upon her savior. It was the man who she had thought was her most serious competition back in the studio. Evidently, she had been right, as his broad shoulders, tight pecs and firm butt had all been returned to him, which meant he had succeeded where so far Rio had failed. Rio shook her head to clear it of the disturbing new light in which she saw her competitor. "The man is a rival, not a potential mate," she chided herself quietly. Regardless of the perspective Rio viewed him with though, he was more than a match for the other man. The two men dusted themselves off as they recovered from the initial collision. Although the more attractive man was up first, he waited for the unscrupulous one to stand up and raise his fists. "You're a disgrace to men," he told the loser as he deftly delivered a swift punch to his abdomen which took him down, winded. The blow had been too quick for the other man's ineffective defense to make any difference. Rio could scarcely believe what had happened. "But I thought you all agreed to gang up on me," she asked. Her savior shook his head ruefully. Forget about that. It wasn't my idea, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up about it sooner. I'll stay here and make sure this punk doesn't bother you or anyone else. You had better get going if you don't want to lose. May the best man win. Rio felt a strange sort of obligation to this man for the help he had given her. He could have just left her to lose so he could take her for himself, but he had not. Surely, he had won before that awful nerd and would have first choice. Rio hoped that if she lost, she would be chosen by him rather than that awful dweeb. A small part of her mind began to fret over whether or not she was pretty enough, and she started thinking of the other women as her competitors in more ways than one. However, those thoughts were only in her subconscious as she ran off and resumed her searching, leaving the useless fake orb behind. I wish I had asked him his name. Rio regretted. She didn't know why, but in failing to get his name it felt as if though she had lost something. She shrugged off the feeling. She had lost both bargaining chips, and from what she had seen, 2 people had won and 2 people had been eliminated. Her chances were not looking as good as they had once been. Rio had by now combed the entire park with her scrutinizing search, and was beginning to fear that either she had missed something, or that what she needed to find had already been found by someone else. She was only afraid for a moment though, because she still saw other competitors scurrying about, so the contest was clearly still ongoing. So I must have a chance, right? She wondered. Unless, of course, another competitor had found her masculinity and had thrown it into the pond, or worse, if the producers were stacking the show against her to ensure she would lose. She shuddered at the thought, for she was the contestant who had been shot by the new model of the TG ray gun. Surely the producers wanted to show it off as much as they could. Before she could despair over much about what the network may or may not have been plotting, she found something which had definitely not been there when she passed this area of the park earlier. Sitting down at an intersection of 3 paths was a plain-looking man wearing a suit with charcoal stripes. He sat patiently before a table with 2 chairs, and as Rio cautiously approached the table she saw that upon it lay a chess set. Was this a blessing, or was it a curse? For Rio was lucky that she had indeed played a fair amount of chess, and not only did she know the rules but she could best most of the casual opposition she faced. However, her opposition at school was exactly that, casual, and a grandmaster of the game could easily trounce her. It would be ridiculous for the show to pit contestants who might not know the first thing about chess against a professional though. Rio thought, so there has to be a way to overcome this challenge. That meant that the player already seated should be mediocre at best, and Rio should be able to defeat him. Unless, she pondered, this challenge was set here with the sole purpose of eliminating me from the game. As she thought about that, she realized just how suspicious it was that this person had not been here earlier, and had only shown up now. It would have been easy for the network execs to gather some background on Rio, find she had past chess experience and use her overconfidence against her. For all her deliberation she knew that she would have to win this game somehow. And, if the producers wanted, they could easily stack every chance she might get against her. She figured she may as well take a chance at what seemed like a contest that could potentially be fair. So, she approached the man with more confidence and waited for him to relate the terms of the challenge. When she stood tensely behind the empty chair the man beckoned for her to sit, and she did. Sitting down felt rather unusual in her new body, but it was certainly a very, very welcome change from all that running around and standing up. Even if she lost it would almost be worth it just for this chance to relax her strained shoulders. Once she had settled down into the chair and made herself comfortable, her opponent explained the challenge in plain terms. I checkmate you, you will be my mate. Should you mate me, you will have victory, he said. So just as expected, it would be a one-on-one match of chess. All the pieces on both sides were present, so there would be no handicap. The only thing to determine the winner would be their respective skill. Rio's chair was set to be playing white, which meant that she would make the first move. As she reached out her hand to start the match, she was interrupted momentarily. "Since you are about to become my mate, there is something I feel you should know," the man told her. "I have already obtained one mate, so you would be my second. I hope you will not mind. Esmeralda, come forth, please, dear." With that, an attractive young Latino woman stepped out from where she had been hiding behind a tree and approached her husband. Rio recognized her as one of the other contestants, but now her eyes were glazed over in appreciative stupor for her husband. "Yes, my love, what is it?" Esmeralda inquired as she sat on her knees beside the man who had thwarted her at chess and ended her chances of winning the contest. "I will be taking this woman as my wife momentarily. I was wondering if that would be okay with you," the man said. Although he spoke to Esmeralda, his eyes never left Rio, and he wore a playful smile. The other woman sized Rio up before replying, "I think that she has very broad hips and will help me bring you many children. I only hope that since I was your first wife you will give me the honor of taking me to your bedchamber first, so that I may be the mother of your firstborn son." She was completely demure in her response. All traces of her former male persona had been eliminated. Rio gulped as she realized that the stakes of this match were higher than she had thought. Although it was not too late for her to back out, she would not let this man's mind games defeat her. So he beat one opponent, big deal, Rio thought. If anything, that just means that this wasn't set up specifically to beat me. Rio remembered who that Latino had been before she was transformed. She had been one of the jocks who didn't look very bright. The fact that such a dolt had been defeated meant nothing, really. Rio made his opening move with firm resolve. As the opening moves played out, Rio did her best to consider the impact of his opponent's choices and recall games she had played previously. She thought deeply about what she should do next. After some reflection, she saw an opportunity to try and attack the enemy's rook and queen simultaneously with her knight. The opponent would be able to protect one piece or the other, but they were both valuable pieces, and this classic fork maneuver would ensure that they lost at least one of the two valuable pieces. It was a basic ploy, but the opportunity was there, so Rio took it. Her opponent, however, had been thinking ahead much more than Rio. He was aware of the vulnerability, and just before Rio could finish the maneuver he defended against it by setting up an attack of his own which was even more deadly. Rio had to abort her plan in order to retreat to a more defensive position. Her ploy had failed, and in trying she had committed her knight to attack while sacrificing control of the most of the center of the board, which was the most tactically important region. "Relying on a knight to save you," the man snickered. How typical of a woman. In time, Rio's lost control would cost her. They exchanged piece for a time, pawn for pawn, knight for bishop, pawn for pawn again, until a few turns later Rio found herself losing a pawn and gaining nothing in exchange. Worse still, every trade-off that she had been forced to make granted her opponent's pieces better and better position of the board. She was fighting an uphill battle, losing more and more momentum, and it was only a matter of time until her opponent gave her a firm shove backwards, which sent her tumbling down to the bottom. Sweat built up on her brow. As more and more of her pieces were eliminated, she was left with fewer and fewer options. Also, since there were less pieces on the board, it was easier to consider where the game would go from here. That's what allowed Rio to see it. She would lose the game in 4 more turns. There was nothing she could do about it. The opponent's advantage he had earned in numbers and position afforded him the flexibility to mount an attack against Rio's king which she could not stop. No matter which moves she thought of trying, she could see a counter from her opponent which rendered them ineffective. In 4 more turns, Rio would be a simpering housewife, just like Esmeralda had become. Inwardly, Rio cursed at herself for losing. How had it happened? Was it because, now that she was a woman, she had lost her ability to think logically and critically? No, she thought, that was just a weak excuse. She had played as well as she ever had. Her opponent's moves had simply been more efficient in the long term. She had been outplayed. Her opponent hadn't done anything particularly fancy, but he had made his moves quickly and confidently, and was no doubt extremely good at chess. He had probably been thinking and playing the game on an entirely different level than Rio. It had been a hopeless challenge from the beginning. Just as she was reaching out to knock her king over to signal a forfeit, she had a revelation. What had been the precise wording of the challenge? Did she even have to win to win? Should I checkmate you, you will be my mate. Should you mate me, you will have victory, recalled. There was another way to overcome this obstacle. Although Rio shuddered to think of it, the wording had been a double entendre. Initially she had thought that should you mate me had just meant should you checkmate me, and checkmate was, of course, the word which meant winning a game of chess. There was, however, a very different way to mate someone, a way Rio wasn't sure she was even willing to try. It seemed, though, that one way or another she would have to mate with this man. Either she could get up and do it now, or she could lose the match and become a devout housewife and do it later. She had the choice to choose to do it or be forced to do it. Is that even a choice? She wondered. Her head hurt when she tried to think about it. However, when she phrased it to herself a different way, it made her decision easier for her. Do I have the balls to do it? She questioned herself, and with that she rose from her chair and moved over to her opponent. She didn't just move casually though, she moved with a seductive intent that came to her more naturally than she dreamed possible. It was only a short distance she had to move, but that didn't stop her hips from taking as long and twisting a route as they wanted. I grow tired of this dreary game, Rio lied as she slowly sat down on the man's lap and wrapped one arm around his shoulders. She very deliberately made sure that one of her butt cheeks was on top of the man's crotch rather than one of her more sensitive parts she was much less comfortable with. That was a prudent decision on her part, because the man's reaction to a beautiful woman sitting on his lap and seducing him was quite predictable. How about we play a game that's a little more interesting? She offered. Although her body was quite comfortable with her actions, Rio had to fight against the repugnant feeling of what she was doing as she ran her free hand slowly down the man's chest. Even though it didn't feel at all wrong, she knew it was. But she was going to win this game. She looked deeply into his eyes as she brought her mouth ever closer to his. The man closed his eyes and braced himself to be kissed, but Rio opted to instead lick her partner's lips sensuously with her tongue, and the man blushed deeply and let out a low groan as the tension left his body. For a moment Rio was confused by his actions, but suddenly it dawned on her what had happened and she leapt off of him faster than lightning. You pig! How dare you, do that in your pants while I'm sitting in your lap? Rio raged, although truth be told she was much more disgusted by her own actions than by his. Heh, the chess master laughed while still enjoying the release of his climax. I've always been much better at chess than I am with the ladies. I thought I had you there, but you figured it out at the end. Congratulations, here's your prize. The man extended one of the familiar spheres which contained a contestant's masculinity, although, yet again, it turned out to belong to someone other than Rio. She snatched it away from the man and stormed off without looking back. The man appreciated the view she gave from behind, and Esmeralda was certainly happy to see her go. Rio's mind was a storm of thought that had exploded out the moment she had jumped out of the man's embrace. She had been trying very hard not to think before then, instead just trying to let her body guide her actions to do what must be done. Now her thoughts were bouncing all over the place inside her head. One part of her thoughts was taking a bizarre pride in her feminine sexuality, for what she had achieved. Another was disappointed that the result had not given her any satisfaction. Yet another part was very disgusted by the first two parts, and tried vigorously to deny their existence. The fourth and largest part of her was simply very relieved to be out of the situation. "I need to get my body back," she grumbled. "I mean, it's not like I'm any different, or any dumber, but it's just not right. For me to flirt with a man like that, and to even enjoy it on some level, that's just wrong." However, she struggled with how to explain to herself the why how it was wrong. Different, certainly, but wrong? It just is. She gave up searching for a logical reason she couldn't find. Besides, I don't want people thinking I'm some kind of pervert. With those thoughts in mind, she continued her walk in the park. Meanwhile, back at the studio in the producers' meeting. Producer 1 status report. Has the target contestant been eliminated yet? Producer 2 no. Contestant Rio remains in the competition, as per the plan. Producer 1 good. What were the figures that your aide came up with again? Producer 3 we're forecasting approximately a 1.7% increase in sales of the new model per minute of airtime we give the Transformi. That converts to dash Producer 2 a whole lot of yen. Producers 1, 2 and 3 all grin wickedly. Producer 1 how is the studio audience enjoying the live feeds? What are the expected ratings? Producer 3 higher than we've ever had before. If we pull this off right, we're looking at an estimated 127% increase in revenue over the same quarter from last year. Producer 1 marvelous. And I take it the fix is ready to be deployed? Producer 2 yes. No contestant has ever overcome it. We just need to wait until the target is in the area and then we will deploy it. Contestant Rio will be eliminated and we will ensure maximum exposure of the new ultra super sexy form by guaranteeing her appearance on a follow-up date show. Producer 1 good work, gentlemen. Now, how are the plans for our ultra super sexy Rio line of dolls and related merchandise coming? And now back to the park. Rio was just about ready to pull her hair out, which would be rather painful given how much of it she had. The reason for her frustration was that she had seen 2 more contestants return to their male forms. She had even witnessed what one of them had done to retrieve his mojo. It had been placed in the upper branches of a tree which had grown at the jerk's feet. All he had done was climb a tree. After seeing that, Rio was almost certain things were being rigged against her. Still, though, the game went on. There were now 4 winners and 3 losers, which left 3 remaining contestants competing for the final spot. If she was lucky enough that the mojo she won from the chess match belonged to one of the 2 contestants still competing, rather than one of those already eliminated, then that meant that person could not win and Rio had a 50-50 chance. Somehow though, she doubted that was the case. What with the show being rigged and all. I wish I had never signed up for this stupid contest, she griped. I really wanted a date, but being alone isn't so bad, is it? She knew those words were empty the moment she said them. They were as empty as the small apartment home she returned to every day after work. She couldn't stand living with her parents, so she had moved out. But, now, she was barely able to stand living alone. In hindsight, she had to admit that there were probably better ways to meet people than signing up for extreme reality TV contests. So distracted was she with her internal monologue that she completely failed to notice that she had walked right into what would be her next challenge. The challenge that, as far as the producers were concerned, would be her last. Walking into the challenge was a pretty big oversight on Rio's part. How big of an oversight? Well, the challenge in question was actually a rather nasty-looking dragon. According to its resume, it was 12 feet tall, 30 feet long, from its snout to the tip of its tail, and 20 feet in wingspan. Although people were known to pad their resumes, the fact remained that as far as oversights went, he made for a pretty big one. The studio audience gasped, applauded and laughed as Rio was knocked to the ground by absent-mindedly bumping into Tabiat, the dragon. For viewers new to the show out there, Tabiat is something of a guest star on the show. He ravaged the countrysides of the world. He loves to travel, for centuries, building himself a sizable draconic hoard. However, with the advent of the 21st century, and most currencies becoming digital, he began to find that pillaging just wasn't getting him the kind of wealth it used to. He tried attacking banks and swooping away with ATMs, but it just didn't feel the same anymore. So, one day, he abducted a very frightened bank teller who was kind enough to set him up with his own account and credit card. Then he wrote himself up a resume and fired it off, looking for a way to put some funds into his account. He wasn't about to sit by hoarding gold and gems when his cousin Lurjai already had a Swiss bank account with over $500,000 in it. No. It was time to get with the times, so he applied to many places and eventually came to find himself employed by Megacorp. Tabiat's first and most frequent role is that, once the game has gone on for a bit too long, he swoops in to eliminate competitors. However, he soon became a star and now also does some motivational speaking and book signings for his latest inspirational novel, There's a Little Dragon in All of Us. While not on the job, he sleeps in his luxurious cave atop a bed of custom-designed and highly durable laptops which are logged into his various accounts and investments. Rio gulped as she gazed upon the enormity of her error. Now that the dragon had found her, there was no doubt that she was doomed. Well, it was a good run while it lasted, she thought. Defeat me, mortal, or else become a maiden awaiting thy knight. Tabiat roared. Any contestant Tabiat defeats is transformed into a princess that he hauls back to his nearby lair within the park. Any other contestant who can stealthily rescue a captured princess is dubbed a knight and given their masculinity. Tabiat threw a sword that he had held within his coiled tail towards Rio. The blade landed on the ground at Rio's feet with a clutter. It was an enchanted weapon, supernaturally light and sharp. Rio picked it up, not that it made the fight any more even. Not much of a difference between woman versus dragon and woman with sword versus dragon, she grumbled. Fah! I have my honor. You are armed, now get ready to perish. Tabiat bellowed. Oh please, Rio rolled her eyes. You just like to play with your food. Most fans agreed with Rio. The dragon was known to enjoy theatrics, which was the reason Rio had not yet been chomped. Of course, Rio would not really be eaten, as the dragon's contract had a clear no-devouring clause written into it, although there had been mistakes in the past. Rather, Tabiat's claws and teeth were laced with a weak venom which worked to slowly knock a contestant out. Being so much stronger and faster than a human, it was easy for Tabiat to be careful and deliberately make numerous small, shallow cuts, although he was also quite capable of ripping people in two with ease. As you can imagine, this was not much of a comfort for poor Rio. She almost considered just giving up, in order to guarantee not being eaten. It had been some months since the last time the dragon had accidentally eaten a contestant, but perhaps it was better to be safe than sorry. Tabiat's official comment the last time he ate a contestant was that it had been regrettable, but tasty. Rio was no quitter though, so she decided that she would go down fighting. The dragon charged her, and she slashed, spun, dodged and whirled her way into combat. If it sounds to you like Rio was a natural swordswoman, that is only because you do not have the video clips to watch. All the slashing, spinning, dodging and whirling was basically just wild attempts and narrow escapes. Rio had never wielded a blade before, and had no idea what she was doing. All her efforts really amounted to was a lot of jiggling of air, jiggly attributes, and plenty of opportunities for the cameraman to catch her from a rather risque angle. What it did not result in much of, however, was injured dragon. Tabiat, hamming it up for the camera as always, let out a deep bellowing laugh as he stuck his neck out to mock her. "Come on, pretty lady, and hit me with your best shot," he mocked as he blew her a raspberry with his forked tongue. Rio struck out at the exposed neck, slicing it and beheading the dragon with one fell cleave. It was easy enough, even with her limited strength, to chop the head off thanks to the enchanted blade, once the dragon had stopped moving. "Oh," gasped the severed head of Tabiat, as Rio wiped sweat from her brow. The separated head gave a final twitching spasm before dying. If you find Tabiat's nonchalance surprising, you would no doubt have also been surprised when he promptly regrew his lost neck and head. "I hate you, I really do," Rio informed the dragon. There was much speculation in the Draconic Inquirer that, somewhere in his family tree, one of Tabiat's ancestors had fooled around with a hydra. This was an incredibly scandalous accusation which he denied vehemently, but there was no doubt that his regenerative powers were top-notch. At this point, Rio figured she needed a plan. Fighting was pointless. No one had ever beaten the dragon, because, in addition to being agile and mighty, he was impossible to kill. The only other option was to run. That wouldn't work either though, since Tabiat was faster and had more endurance. Rio struggled to think herself out of this bind. "Running at least might buy me a bit more time before he gets bored of chasing me," Rio thought. Indeed, Tabiat would probably slack off and nip at her heels for a while just to draw things out. If she managed to buy enough time, she might even run into another contestant. She didn't necessarily have to beat the dragon, if she could find the other players and make sure they lost to him first. Feeling confident and in control of the situation once more, Rio turned around and ran screaming like a little girl. Confidently. The chase lasted for some time, however, alas, Rio did not run into the other contestants as she had hoped. On further reflection, she realized that it was probably quite easy for them to hide from or avoid the gigantic dragon, who was crashing through the park shouting, "I'm going to have princess for dinner tonight." Finally, too tired to continue for the final time, she collapsed against the side of a newspaper and snack stand on the edge of the park that had been shut down for the filming. Tabiat reared up on his hind legs, spread his wings and looked as fierce as he could for the camera. "Given up, have you?" he mocked. Although she had no energy left, Rio remained defiant. "I will never give up," she gasped a little between each word, panting from exhaustion. She reached for the nearest thing at hand, a chocolate bar from the newsstand, and threw it at the dragon in her final act of opposition. Tabiat lunged forward to snap it out of the air, and easily devoured the useless projectile. Then he stopped. His eyes bulged just a little. He began to twitch. "No," he gasped as he rolled onto his back, helpless. "Was that chocolate bar you just threw a Snickers? How could you know that I'm allergic?" Rio could not believe her luck as she used the magical sword to help push herself up to a standing position. "It seems I may win after all," she smiled as she walked towards Tabiat. "Fa," the dragon said, "though you have me paralyzed, you still cannot win. Any damage you do, I will still regenerate. In time, I will recover, and then I will rend your flesh upon my fangs for what you have done," he threatened. "You cannot defeat me." "Ho," Rio laughed, drawing nearer and then began to circle the beast. However, she made one slice. I think she made another slice as she moved around him. She made a third cut. Defeat you just fine, she said as she completed her circle and chopped off his fourth and final foot. They lay inert on the ground, lifeless. The fans watching live at the studio gasped in astonishment. The producers cringed in terror. Rio stood exultant and triumphant, the blood spurting from the dragon's wounds onto her, making her look somehow even more beautiful, as well as very, very deadly. Tabiat, oddly enough, laughed. Well played, mortal, well played. Truly, you deserve your prize of voice, one of the producers chimed in through the headset Tabiat wore inside his ear. No. No. No prize. Tabiat was a bit surprised by the instruction, which only he could hear, but they were his bosses, so he had to do his best to comply. He quickly resumed his earlier sentence, but the pause had been very evident. But, unfortunately, your mojo is in, another castle. Sorry about that, Tabiat improvised like a pro, showing that he had earned his Emmy for Best Dragon in a supporting role on a reality TV show. The fans called out foul in outrage. The producers looked at each other nervously. Tabiat just kind of chilled and regrew his feet while paralyzed. He gave the camera a charmingly toothy dragon smile. Rio stormed off. She was furious. After suffering through everything they've thrown at me so far, she thought, and experiencing not only being turned into a woman but things which are making me wonder what exactly being a man had meant anyways, they throw this at me? I don't think so, she cursed. As far as she was concerned, her walk in the park was over. Her walk back to the studio to wreak righteous vengeance, however, had only just begun. Rio ran like the wind, uncaring of her earlier exhaustion and thinking only of her destination. Pure rage fueled her now, and the adrenaline that pumped through her triumphed over the dull aches and protests of her overworked muscles. Her body moved with a fluid grace as her long hair and ribbons billowed out behind her as she ran. She pushed aside anyone too slow to get out of her way, and she ran across intersections, weaving through traffic with little concern for her own safety. Luckily for her, the streets were busy and what little progress was being made came to a standstill when drivers got an eyeful of her. Many people wondered what on earth such an attractive woman was doing out in public dressed in some sort of bizarre outfit vaguely reminiscent of a sailor sifuku, carrying a sword, and covered in blood. Few of them asked any questions. It was only a matter of time until she arrived at the studio. The doors had been locked, but the sword the dragon had given her proved to be a very useful tool. She used it to cut a window into the door with ease and climbed through the opening. She found herself once again entering the stage area where she had been transformed. The studio audience was there, where they had been watching live feeds. They gasped and pointed at her as she made her entrance. Rio-chan, one shouted. You won. We saw it, another cried out. We support you, Rio-chan, from a third. Ryochan. Ryochan, they began to chant, cheering her onwards. For a moment she paused, struck by the adulation of the crowd. She felt herself get caught up in the contagious energy of it, felt it surge through her. For a moment she simply stood there proud and glorious. However, the moment passed, and Rio felt absurd in her ridiculous outfit, not to mention that her body was all wrong. After all, it wasn't really him they were cheering, but rather her. Rio approached one of the lighting technicians who tried to shy away from her intimidating presence. The producers, she stated with a cold fury. It had not been a question, but the poor frightened tech could see the rage in her eyes and knew what she wanted. Our room 105. Down that hall, he stammered as he pointed Rio towards the meeting room the producers had sequestered themselves in. It was not far, but Rio was surprised when the sounds of the cheers did not fade even after she left the large central area to venture down a hall. Her fans continued the chant, even in her absence. She couldn't felt but feel a little flattered. Rio had more important feelings to address at the moment though, such as the burning anger she had for those in charge of the show. She found herself standing before the door to room 105. Once again she found that the door was locked. However, this time she tried a different approach than simply slicing her way in. She took a moment to collect herself, and then said calmly, "Open the door, or I will slice my way in and cut you all into ribbons." There were muted sounds of a hasty argument from the other side of the door, then the sound of someone getting up from a chair, followed by a click as the door was unlocked. Rio heard the person who unlocked the door scurry quickly back into their seat before she could enter. Once inside, she found 3 weaselly, greedy, corporate bastards. Well, actually, to be fair, they looked more like respectable businessmen, but her perception of them was just a little biased at the moment. We regret to inform you that while you were on your way here, a 5th contestant reclaimed his energy. Which means that you lost, one of them meekly informed her. Rio turned to face the speaker, gave the man a level stare. "Shut up," she ordered him. He gave a weak little squeal, but otherwise complied. "You can't just kill us," one of them protested, "there are laws." "You'd be jailed." "Oh." Rio turned to the speaker and tilted her head just a fraction of an inch. "I'm thinking the headline will be Tragic Side Effect of Heightened TG Ray Gun Leads Contestant to Emotionally Unstable State. Ensuing Psychotic Rampage was Inevitable." Seems like a pretty good defense to me. What do you think? Needless to say, Rio was a little upset. She had more than her fill of the games these men had been playing with her. She would be the one in control now. "But we are the only ones who can restore you to being a man," one of the shrewd producers pointed out. Rio sighed to herself. As satisfying as revenge would be, they had a point. Still, it was best to make them think she would go through with it. Their fear gave her the advantage. "Perhaps I will spare your lives, but you will return my previous form. I'm not sure what shenanigans you have been planning, but this is over. Now." She slammed her sword into the ground at her feet to emphasize the point. The producers gave a collective cringe as it cut into the floor with ease. But, you signed a contract. You have already agreed to the date. You lost the show, as per the rules," one of the greedier producers who valued his life less than his peers pointed out. "I lost? Maybe, but I don't think so. I think you rigged the game, and the people out there she gestured back to where the chanting could still be heard, agree with me. If I go public and press the issue, I think it will hit you guys where it hurts, right in your precious little wallets. What's more important though is that in this little game yours you toyed around with my gender like it was your plaything. I signed up to be zapped, sure, but I never agreed to the rest of your sick little game. I guess you just wanted to make sure you exposed and exploited this ultra super sexy form you gave me as much as you could, huh? Well, guess what, you crossed a line, and I intend to make you pay for it." Sweat built up on the producers' foreheads as Rio continued her diatribe. By the end, it was dripping down in beads from their foreheads and chins. "Surely, we can come to some sort of understanding," one of them desperately pleaded. He did not look hopeful about it. Rio cursed silently and wanted to chop their heads off, but decided to bargain instead. She knew that it was the only real way for her to resolve the situation, but that didn't mean she couldn't fantasize about a happier, bloodier ending. "You want a deal? Here's your deal. I'll spare your sad little lives, and I'll even suffer through the date you were so hell-bent on sending me on. In exchange, though, I want my cut of everything you get from sales of this new ray gun and any other merchandise you sell that uses me as advertising. I want 50% of the revenue. Not the profit, mind you, but the revenue. I won't have you sleazeballs coming up with some way to create fictitious interdepartmental costs to cut me out of my share. And I'd think long and hard before rejecting this offer if I were you. It's the only one you're going to get." They were silent for a moment, then conferred amongst themselves. Panicky chatter, exaggerated hand movements and a large amount of finger-pointing punctuated their debate. They reached an agreement in less than a minute though. "Deal," their elected spokesperson said, grudgingly. Under normal circumstances they would never have done such a thing, but the blood-stained Rio was truly a savage and terrifying presence to behold. It was sort of like negotiating with the angel of death. "Great. Now come out with me to the studio to announce the deal where it's nice and recorded and witnessed, and then I get this date over with and you zap me back," Rio said as she hauled the spokesperson out by the scruff of his neck. She was still quite angry, but at least she had maneuvered the situation into being at least financially favorable. Rio was not excited at the prospect of having to sit through a date as a woman, but compared to what she had experienced earlier it would be a trivial thing for her to endure. It did not take long for the contestants who had still been in the park to make their way back into the studio. Hair and makeup cleaned up the blood Tabiat had spilled onto Rio. She removed her stained outfit and changed into the traditional kimono that the contestants wore for the date selection process. It did not show off her beauty as well as the previous clothes had, but it did have the fringe benefit of not looking completely ridiculous. The producers announced that Rio was to be a business partner with them for the new ray gun and other Ryo-chan brand products which would be announced soon. Rio smiled as the crowd cheered for her upon the announcement. She was sad to know that when this was all over she would go back to her lonely life, but at least she would finally have a decent income. As the saying goes, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you might just get what you need, she mused. It was finally the moment of truth. The dates were going to be assigned. Rio took one last chance to look everyone over. First, her gaze fell upon the creep who had knocked her down. He was the sort of person who she would have just dismissed as being a harmless loser in her male body, but now he just seemed so much worse. Revolting, shifty, creepy, she couldn't stand him. It was hard to explain why exactly, but the long and short of it was that she felt she might puke if she had to date him. The worst part was that he had placed second. Thankfully, Rio thought, the most attractive guy placed first. Not that it matters precisely that he's attractive. Which he is. Not that it matters. God, look at me talking to myself like this. I think this crazy day has driven me mad. Rio fidgeted slightly, more than a little uncomfortable with the way this new body colored her perceptions. She took a more critical look at the man who had won. When you thought about it rationally, there was nothing about those shoulders of his which made her want to run her hands along them. And it wasn't like there was anything in that strong, upright, confident way he held himself that made him stand out over the other guys. Okay, I have to admit it, she thought to herself, he's hot. At least for now, while I'm still stuck like this. It's not like it matters though, because tomorrow I'll just go back and I can forget about this whole thing. So, with that in her mind, she did her best to smile, look pretty and bear it all until she could put it behind her. With the way she looked, of course he would pick her. It didn't really matter whether or not he was good looking. She was just relieved that he would pick her and she wouldn't have to date the creep, and then that would be that. Or would it? She worried to herself. Rio's until now insurmountable confidence wavered just a little. She took a look at the other women. While she knew she was a looker, she couldn't deny that they were beautiful as well. Most people would probably pick her, but different people liked different things. What if instead of a woman like her, the man preferred someone with a different ethnicity? Like maybe the Latino woman Esmeralda, who had lost the chess match. The kimono, strangely, did look quite good on her. Or maybe he liked someone a bit taller. Or shorter. Or more busty. Or less. She gently bit her lip, as little butterflies fluttered inside her and she began to worry. Suddenly, a part of her really hoped that she would be picked. A bigger part of her thought it was silly and that it didn't matter what anyone thought she looked like, since this wasn't her real body. She would be changing back, after all. Despite being at odds with each other, both thoughts were there in her mind, undeniable. This stupid show has my mind at odds with itself, it's ridiculous, she thought. I knew I should have just cut off those jerks' heads. Oh well. And now the moment you have all been waiting for, ladies and gentlemen, the host announced, time for our first place winner, Ken, here to choose his date. So that was his name, Rio noted. Part of her felt like she never wanted to forget it, while the rest of her scoffed and thought of the dozen other Kens she already knew. Just a silly name. I pick, Ken said as he raised his finger and moved it down the line of eligible dates. Rio's heart began to beat just a little bit faster as Ken's pointing hand slowly passed over each girl and came closer and closer to her. Her, he declared, and sure enough it was Rio he had chosen. A smile came unbidden to her lips, though she quickly quelled it. The audience clapped along merrily, and little bits of confetti descended upon the stage. I'm just happy I don't have to date the scuzzy one, she justified to herself while she began to wonder what type of date she would be taken on. She didn't bother to tear herself away from those idle dreams. After all, it's not like the rest of the picking process mattered. After the choosing was finished, Rio was taken once again to hair and makeup to be made over for her date. Unlike the previous times, when she had just sat and let them do their thing, this time she gave some feedback and said what she liked and what she didn't. It was unusual for her, she knew, but she just felt energetic, and sitting like a lump of lard while they styled her over didn't suit her mood. Besides, once she got talking with the stylists, it turned out they were pretty funny people. It was not much later that Rio found herself patiently waiting for her date to show up, at the fancy French restaurant that Ken had chosen for their date. So far the waiter had come by to ask her if she wanted anything 4 times, but she had only had her water refilled. Rio sat, feeling annoyed. It wasn't like she wanted the date to start, but just having to sit around and wait was making her impatient. She passed the time by making a card castle out of the bread from the bread basket. As beautiful as she looked, and as refined as the makeup and accessories that the show had provided for the event were, she had a ways to go before her behavior matched what was expected of a lady at a formal restaurant. She had spent so much time terrified of having to go out on a date as a woman. To be stood up like this seemed rather anticlimactic. She figured she should be happy for not having to endure silly conversation, or a dance, or anything, but that was not what she felt like. She didn't feel like that at all. With a bitter sigh, she knocked over her tiny bread castle. It had been an hour, and it was apparent that her date was not coming. She had done what the show's contract required of her. With no date, and with the studio closed so she couldn't be turned back into a man until tomorrow, so she had nothing to do but go home. Once home, she shut the door behind her and went down to sit in the chair in her living room. There wasn't enough space for a couch. She drew her legs up until her knees were pressed against her bosom and hugged herself as she began to cry softly. Though she was ashamed to do it, she had known it was what she would do from the moment she had left the restaurant. What do I care that I got rejected? She sniffled. It's not like this is even me. Still though, it hurt just as much as every other time she had faced rejection. Rio had not had a fortunate love life. It wasn't simply that being stood up made her much sadder or lonelier than she had been before. Rather, it was that she had always been a bit sad and lonely living here in this apartment. Until now she had just chosen to ignore it by detaching herself from her life in favor of manga and anime. But right now she just couldn't do that anymore. So she cried instead. She continued doing so until a knock came at her door, a gentle rapping. She would have ignored it, to continue lamenting, but no one ever knocked at her door. Ever. So she got up to answer it. Standing there, on her doorstep, was no one other than Ken. For reasons she did not understand, her gut wrenched in two directions, as he was both the person she wanted to see most and the person she wanted to see least at this moment. She had no idea how to react, so she just stood there. Ken's stance was not the proud and noble one with which he had held himself in the studio. He looked full of regret. "Look," he explained, "I'm really sorry I stood you up. I only came here because you deserve an explanation." Rio said nothing, so Ken went on, "When I entered that dumb contest, all I cared about was winning and getting a date. I was looking forward to it so much after I succeeded so early, because I knew I had placed well. However, I also saw what happened to you. You were one of the winners, fair and square. As much as I wanted a date, I knew that you shouldn't have to take anyone, me or anyone else, on one. It wasn't right. So, I picked you and stood you up so you wouldn't have to. I wouldn't have felt right doing anything else." Rio blinked. He seemed to be waiting for a response. Thanks," she said. Ken nodded and pulled himself together. He was standing now the way he had been standing before, back in the studio. "That's not all though," he continued. "When I, or indeed when any man, looks at you, it is hard to see anything other than the most beautiful woman on the face of the earth. But, when I watched you playing that game, that wasn't the only thing that I saw. I also saw that you are not only brilliant, but also brave. Although I won the game early, I have to admit there is no way I could have overcome the things you did. I don't know much about you yet, but I do know that you're amazing. So, I'd like to give you these." He took out a bouquet of flowers he had behind his back and handed them to Rio. She accepted them with trembling hands. More thoughts and emotions flew through her head than she could count. Certainly, not all were fond of the idea of a man at her door giving her flowers. Far from it. "And, if you'd like," Ken continued, "I'd like to take you out on a date. To get to know you better. Tonight. The park is still closed down from the day's filming, so if we go there now we'd have the place to ourselves. It really is lovely this time of year, and we could catch the sunset if we're quick. But it's fine if you don't want to. It wasn't easy for me to pass up a date with someone as stunning as you, but ultimately, it had to be your choice." Rio wasn't sure about a lot of things. She wasn't sure if this was right or wrong. She wasn't sure if she could live a week as a woman, let alone a lifetime. However, there were a few things she was sure about. She was sure that she didn't want to be alone anymore. And she was sure that here, now, she wanted to kiss this man. To hell if it was right or wrong. So, she dropped the flowers, wrapped her arms around him and kissed him. The kiss was long, deep and passionate. Even afterwards she still didn't know what to think, but she did know what she felt. She felt wonderful. So, with that feeling in her heart, she took Ken by the hand and led him out of her apartment building. She had a lot of things to figure out, but she could begin figuring them out during her walk in the park.